Hello everyone, this is Jonathan Little. If you guys can hear me, please type something in the chat box to let me know you can hear me, and we will go ahead and get started. Alright, awesome. Everyone can hear me. If you guys have any questions about any of the hands displayed or any of the topics discussed throughout this video, please type the question in. If you have hands about specific questions that you would like to know the answer to that you played, please hold those questions until the end of the webinar. I'm going to have a section where you guys can ask me any questions that you would like. So let's go ahead and get started. Today we are going to be discussing crushing small stakes cash games, and I think that's something that a lot of players sort of struggle with because, well, the reason a lot of people struggle with crushing small stakes cash games is because of the rake, and also because they're just not that good at cash games yet. And I also think it comes from a general lack of understanding that poker is about your cards. A lot of people think, okay, if I sit here and play good cards, I'm going to win. And while you may win a small amount, the problem with that is that the rake will eat you up. So say you win $10 an hour, but you're paying $12 an hour, you're still going to end up being a losing player after all is said and done. And because of that, you're going to have to do something different if you want to break out of the small stakes and start playing medium stakes and then eventually high stakes. So the things that a lot of people don't think about whenever they're playing is they don't really consider who they're playing against. So you always need to think who you're playing against and also what are they doing wrong. And I feel like a lot of players are looking at their opponents and say, oh, this guy calls with too many hands and this guy folds too often because he's too tight. But then they don't take it one step further such that they don't really think about how do I actually exploit this player. And that's one of the main things I'm going to teach you in this webinar is how to go about exploiting particular players. You need to find out what they do wrong and then do everything in your power to make sure you capitalize on that. So I do want to mention that you probably can beat the small stakes cash games, but you're never by playing only strong hands, but you're never going to become an excellent player by doing this. What's going to happen is you're going to be able to beat the small stakes cash games for a small amount, but as you move up and you start playing against good players who are aware that you're only nut peddling effectively, you're going to find that your win rate really plummets. And I don't want to teach you guys to play small stakes cash games so that you can grind out $10 an hour. I want to teach you guys to be able to crush the small stakes cash games and then move up to bigger cash games where you can actually make $100 an hour. I think that's a lot of players' goals. I mean, if you could go to the casino and grind 5-10 no limit or something like that and have a decent win rate, I think that's ideal for most players over playing 1-2 and grinding out a break-even session. So anyways, if you want to become an excellent poker player, you have to learn how to think about your opponents and figure out how to exploit their weaknesses. Alright, so there are a few general concepts that I think most people already know for the most part, but they don't necessarily think about them all the time. I mean, the first and main concern is that you can only play very few hands from early position, especially if you're playing at a 9-handed table or 10-handed table. I see a lot of players get in trouble, even at the high stakes games, where they'll have a hand like ace-10 offsuit under the gun and raise it, or they'll have queen-jack offsuit. You're going to find that these hands are basically unplayable from early position, and they should be folded. The same thing goes for small pairs a lot of the time. A lot of players think, oh, I can limp in with my small pairs and try to get a good flop. But what that does is it makes your entire limping range made up of all marginal hands. And so your observant opponents, especially as you move up, are going to start raising after you limp, and then they're going to make life tough for you after the flop, unless you flop a set. And then they're probably going to realize after the flop, when you do flop a set, you end up putting a lot of money in the pot. So now they know whenever you limp call pre-flop and then put a lot of money in the pot after the flop, you tend to have a set. And of course, you could recognize this and then exploit them by starting to bluff way more often, but you don't really want to be running huge bluffs out of position, so it gets you in a pretty bad result at the end of the day, even after everyone's done adjusting to each other. So you want to play very few hands from early position, and the hands that you do play, you're usually going to want to play them in the same manner. So I don't think there's anything wrong with playing the small pairs from early position, but I do think you need to play them very similarly to how you play your hands like ace-king and ace-queen and whatnot. We'll discuss that a little bit later. Another general concept is that you should play a lot of hands from late position. I think that a lot of players sort of get in the habit of playing the same basic hand range. And what I mean by hand range is, let's pull up this program. This is a program that shows hands and hand ranges. A lot of players think that they can play all of these big pairs. This is a program from PokerStrategy.com called Equilab. If you do not have it, download it for free. It's a very good program to use to do poker math. A lot of players play a range of hands something like this. The top hands are all suited. the top hands up here are suited. The hands on the bottom are all unsuited. A lot of players play something like this from most positions. They just think these hands are pretty good, and they're going to play them for most spots. And I don't think that's necessarily bad. If we look down here, we see this is about 20% of hands, 19.46% of hands. That's a pretty good number of hands to play. However, from early position, it should be much tighter. It should be more of a range like this. We can cut out all of these. So you see from early position, we're playing something like 10% of hands, or even less. I mean, we don't have to play king, queen offsuit, ace, jack offsuit. Ace, jack suited should probably be played. King, queen suited should probably be played. The small pairs, the bottom ones can be folded. There's nothing wrong with folding these hands if you are at a even relatively tough table, because playing out of position is not going to turn out very well for you. So from early position, you should be playing a hand range of something like this in general. As we're going to see, that your hand range is determined significantly by your opponents, but we'll discuss that in a little bit. This is sort of a general hand range. And then whenever you're on the button, say everyone folds to you and you're on the button and the players in the big blind or the blinds are very tight, you can play all sorts of stuff. And I mean, literally all sorts of hands, not just hands that look sort of good. I'm talking about all sorts of stuff. Pretty much anything that has any potential whatsoever from the button whenever you are playing with fairly weak players in the blind, you can raise all sorts of stuff. So you go from playing 6% of hands in early position to something like 56% of hands in late position. And, I mean, really, if the players in the blinds are somewhat tight, you could go with even more hands. I don't think that would be too big of a deal. And the reason for that is because you are going to be in position, and you're going to be able to exploit your opponents. And a lot of people realize this, and they have heard this many times, but they don't actually apply it. I actually just got back from playing a big online series, the World Championship of Online Poker. I went up to Canada to play that, and I played a pretty good amount of cash games over the weekend. It was 2-5 Zoom poker, which is a really tough game, actually. And the reason it's so tough is because you play so many hands, and because of that, the best players are attracted to that game because you can get in so many more hands than you can at normal poker. So 2-5 Zoom is more like probably mixed between 5-10 and 10-20 online. Anyways, I saw players in that game who were playing the exact same hand range under the gun six-handed as they were on the button. And that's going to be a pretty big leak. And I think you definitely want to have a very high steal percentage. And what that means is you want to be raising a lot of hands from late position, especially when the action folds to you. So keep that in mind as we move forward. One of the other concepts is that you do not need to slow play unless your opponent can catch up to a good but still second best hand. So I guess we'll use a few hands to demonstrate this. So all these hands we're going to be playing 1-2 no limit with $200 stacks. I know that in some casinos you play shorter stacked and some you play deeper stacked, but I think the average is around 100 big blinds. So we're going to use 100 big blinds for most of our examples. So say they fold to you with pocket eights in middle position. You should usually make a standard raise, and a standard raise you're going to find with 100 big blind stacks needs to be something around $6. I know you'll see a lot of players in your game making it 8 or 10 or 20 or something like that, but in general you are going to want to make it $6 because if you think about how the pot's going to grow after the flop, if you raise to $6 pre-flop and get 1 or 2 callers, you can bet something like 2/3 the pot on every street and get pretty much your entire stack in by the river. So for that reason, you don't really need to make it larger pre-flop. You're also going to find from early position, you're going to generally want to make it larger, and from late position, you want to make it smaller because you're going to be bluffing more in late position, but that's not too big of a concern, especially at the smaller stakes. So anyways, let's say you raise with pocket eights, and the big blind calls. All right, the flop comes 9-8-5. This is a spot where when your opponent checks, slow playing would be a huge disaster. And try to think about this for a second. Why do you think slow playing would be a big disaster in this spot? Think about it for just a second, and I'll let you know. To answer the few questions, Donald says, why are we playing Queen 4 suited but not Queen 7 suited? Well, the hand range I showed, it had the Queen 7 offsuit. These hands on the bottom are offsuit. The hand range I had was something like all hands above this line. It was something like this. So these are all offsuit hands. The hands like Queen 7 offsuit, 10-5 offsuit, Jack 5 offsuit, 9-6 offsuit, these are not particularly good hands. You'd much rather play suited hands. I really think it's fine to play a lot of suited hands because those hands have so much more potential. So the hands on the bottom are all unsuited. When I say the bottom, I mean under this line. You see these have an S, these have an O. Offsuit means offsuit, S means suited. So I think Queen 2 suited on the button is a significantly better hand to play than Queen 7 offsuit for that reason, just because it has way more flop potential. And the question about bankroll, we will talk about the bankroll as we get deeper and deeper. So why do we want to bet this flop? You guys pretty much nailed it. We both want to build a pot because we have a good hand, and also there are so many draws our opponent could have that could easily catch up and crush us. Think about this. If our opponent has Jack 10 offsuit and he peels a queen, we're not going to really view that queen as that scary of a card. Or say he has something like pocket tens. If he catches a 10, he's going to end up beating us, and we're going to have a very difficult situation where we can't see that coming. So this is a spot where we want to bet and go from there. If the board was if there were basically no draws on the flop, I'll talk about that in just a second. Slow playing is probably a little bit better. But anyways, right here, there's so many possible cards that are bad for us, and we don't know which cards those are, that we do want to bet and build the pot. So he checks. I'm going to bet something like $9, which is around 3/4 of the pot. And this is going to allow us to start getting money in the pot and set us up to not have to fear all of the random draws. I mean, if our opponent is sitting here with ace-6 and a 7 comes off, we would much rather our opponent just fold if he has ace-6, because even though we are crushing him, we're not going to know if that 7's good. And the same thing goes if he has ace-7. We don't know if the 6 comes, if we're going to be in bad shape. All right, so we bet and he calls. The turn is a 4. So we still are losing the 7-6, but at this point we still have what is basically the nuts. If he does have 7-6, he's probably going to win our whole stack. But that's okay. You're going to find that it is okay to lose a stack in cash games, even if your opponent is somewhat straightforward. So anyways, he checks. I'm definitely going to bet again. I bet 20. Well, someone just said, what if he hits a flush? Well, right now he cannot have a flush because there's not a flush available. But on this board, if he check raised us, well, say he did check raise this board. Say we bet 20, he makes it 50 or 100 or something like that. I'm probably going to call and then not fold on most rivers, because when he check raises the flop, he probably has a made hand of some sort. Or when he check raises the turn, sorry. He probably has a made hand of some sort and not so much a range of draws. But if he does, that's okay. He's drawing somewhat thin, and we can't be sure which draw he has. I mean, say he has Jack 10 of diamonds, and he check raises the turn, and we call, and the river's a king of clubs, and he goes all in. He has by far the worst hand, but we don't really see that draw coming. You're going to find this is a really good spot for your opponents to bluff, because it's very difficult to see which cards are coming. But, yeah, if you guys can still hear me, let me know. Someone has said their audio has stopped. So, if you guys can hear me, okay. Lots of people can still hear me. Hopefully it's just his computer breaking. Hopefully his computer's not breaking, but oh well. Oh well. I guess I should type in something. Oh, he says his audio's back now. Okay, if you guys have slight audio problems throughout this, definitely let me know. And if you guys type in your questions in the question box or the chat box, I believe those come to me. So anyways, okay, someone asked if we check raises the turn, aren't we best just getting it all in? And the answer to that is definitely not. And the reason is because, say he does have ace-6 with the ace-6 of diamonds, right? And we shove the turn. We're going to get it all in, but we are not actually thrilled to get it all in. I'd much rather call and then allow him the opportunity to bluff on the river. By getting it all in, he may fold out some of his worst draws, which is not really what we want. And he also could be bluffing. He could have something like ace-9 and think it's good, and just decide that we have a draw, check raise us, and then whenever we jam on him, he may all of a sudden become convinced, and then he folds a hand that has no equity. So whenever you have a very strong hand, it's usually best to keep your opponent in, because even though he does have plenty of outs, he doesn't have more than around 35% equity going to the river. And you're okay giving him that equity most of the time, because you want to get the rest of his stack. Anyways, we bet 20, he calls. River's a 10 of clubs, so we still beat Jack 10. We lose to Queen Jack, but he probably doesn't have a random Queen Jack because he check called the flop and turn. We do lose to a club draw, which is very likely. And we still lose to the 7-6, but he almost always doesn't have that given he checked again. So he checks the river. Now the question is, do we bet or do we check? And I think this is where it becomes very player dependent. Some opponents, if they're particularly weak, are always going to lead when they hit the draw. And because of that, when he checks the river, you can know now that you can happily value bet. And if you are going to value bet, it doesn't need to be very big, because if your opponent's sitting here with ace-9 or who knows what, pocket jacks. He's not going to call a huge bet. The same thing goes if the river was the 10 of diamonds. I would be a little bit more prone to bet the 10 of diamonds than a 10 of clubs because it's much more difficult for him to have the diamonds on the flop. So if I am going to bet, I think I'd bet something like $35 to $40 on the river because he's probably not going to call a huge bet unless he has a very good hand. And it's somewhat difficult for him to have a very good hand, seeing that 9-8 is somewhat unlikely. He could have pocket 5s, but he probably would have let us know that before now. He could have pocket 9s, but same thing, he would have let us know that as well. He could have Jack 10. You have to think how much he would call if you bet with Jack 10, and I'm not so sure what the right answer is. So now the question is, if we do value bet, say we bet 40 and he goes all in, what are we going to do? We have quite a few people actually asking that question, and I think it's going to be a pretty easy fold against most players. And the reason for that is because we lose to all of the obvious draws, and the draws clearly came in. So this is going to be one of those spots where even though we have a very strong hand on the hand ranking chart, I mean, 3 of a kind is very good, the hands that most players are going to be check raising have us demolished. He's either going to have queen jack or he's going to have a flush. And you look at our hand and it says, can we beat queen jack or a flush? And the answer is absolutely not. So we have a pretty easy fold. And you're going to find that in particularly small and mid-stakes cash games, betting for value with the intention of folding if raised is going to be one of your huge winning plays, because players simply are not capable of bluffing on this river. Brian asked, with what frequency is a good player going to bluff this river? And honestly, not very often. Even though it is a good bluff spot, people aren't going to be bluffing because it's so likely that you have the nuts in this scenario. I mean, when you go bet on this board, you could probably have anything, but most likely you have something fairly good. And most people are not going to have the fortitude to try to bluff someone off something that is clearly pretty good, even though in this spot he could. Notice if you had, let's say we had ace-king of clubs instead, we would have bet this hand exactly the same way on every street. I would not have made a huge bet on the river. I would have still made a $40 bet. And my opponent would be in the exact same scenario, but in that spot I have the nuts. If I had, let's say I had ace-king of diamonds, I'd probably bet $40 on this river again, because it puts my opponent in a pretty bad spot. And that is a spot where you become fairly balanced because you're doing the same thing with your bluffs and your nuts. But in small stakes cash games, I think balance is very overrated. You're going to find that you hear a lot of the best players talking about, oh, you need to be balanced in these spots. But whenever your opponents are not going to take advantage of you getting way out of line, you don't really need to be balanced so much. And so what that means is, against a very, like say we know our opponent's a calling station, he's going to call no matter what we do. Against that particular player, when he checks, we can bet something like $60 or $70, and he's just going to snap us off with whatever he has. And that's perfect. However, if we know our opponent's sort of a nit, and he's only going to call our river bets if he has a flush or better, well, I guess probably a straight or better, then if he checks, we have no value in betting because he's only going to call if we're beat. So this is where you really need to know your opponent, and you need to be paying attention. And for that reason, I do not think there is a clear-cut play on this river, even though a lot of players want to know, oh, what do you do in this spot? It's very tough to say without knowing your particular opponent. And that's why we're going to discuss particular opponents as we move further throughout this session. So let's check out what questions you guys have typed in. Tony says, are we flatting if our opponent leads out for a half-pot bet? And again, that's an extraordinarily player-dependent spot. Some players only bet in the spot if they have a flush or better, and the way you find that out is by calling a few times. And if you call a few times and it turns out they have the nuts every time, then you should probably fold in the future. If you call and he shows you ace-queen of diamonds, then you know, hey, this guy is at least capable of bluffing, so you should probably look him up a few times in the future. Dan says, so would we only value bet in this spot if we had a flush? And I think the answer is definitely no. I would value bet this against most players if I assume they're capable of calling with a worse hand. And you always have to size your bets, especially against weaker players, such that they can call with a weak hand. And that's why you don't want to bet something like $70 here, because he's not going to be able to call unless he has a very good hand. And most very good hands end up having us beat. And yeah, as we've already discussed, if we value bet and he raises, are going to fold to almost everyone, because most players are not capable of check raising in this spot as a bluff, even though it is an excellent spot for that. Let's make sure my thing's recording. Perfect. So yeah, I'm going to value bet this against most players, but I think checking back is fine if you know that he's only going to call with a better hand. Tyler says, what if he is one of the players who has actually shown a big bluff in the past? Okay, so say we know this guy is crazy, and we will talk about crazy players later. If he checks, I bet, and he goes all in, I'm probably going to call if I know he's capable of making crazy plays. And you're going to find that by the time we get to the river, say we bet 40, he goes all in, I'm going to have to call $110 to try to win 300. So I only have to be right 25% of the time. And the way I get that is I have to put in, I do 100 divided by the pot, which would be 300 plus my 100 that I'm putting in. So 1 divided by 4, or 100 divided by 400. And that amount would mean I have to win 25% of the time. And against a crazy person, even if they're bluffing only 33% of the time, you're going to find that it's still a pretty easy situation. David says if he has to leave, can he download this later? Absolutely. Dan asks, if I was in his spot, would I never check raise as a bluff because he could have what you were trying to represent? It depends on my opponent. Again, so from his point of view, if he thinks I can bet with a set or worse, and then fold if raised, then yeah, this is a pretty cool spot to check raise. The problem with this is that in the hero spot, hero's not going to value bet ace-9 or something like that in this spot. So the value betting range for the hero is somewhat tight. He's going to be value betting straights, sets, and flushes. And if a check raise is only going to get us off of sets, that's not going to be that profitable because we're going to have a flush a pretty good amount of the time. Lori says, if the big blind bet big on the river, would I fold? And again, it depends on the player. I think that's what I really want to hammer in here, is that it's not what does he do if we bet. It matters what are his tendencies and what do we know he is capable of. Let's see. Doug also asks, would I call if he leads? And it depends on the player. Donald says, can we explain again why it's better to check call if he raises the turn? Because let's go back to the turn. On the turn, if I bet 20, he makes it, say, 55. If I go all in, he's going to fold out a lot of hands that I actually want him to be in with, like ace-9, 10-9, basically all the made hands I want him to stay in with because he's drawing stone dead. And with the draws, he only has 35% equity, and he's probably going to bluff with those. And, I don't really care if he folds if I jam, and I don't really care if he calls. So against those hands, I'm pretty neutral. I mean, if we know he has a bunch of outs, I don't care. I want him to fold. But that's not the only hand he's check raising. He's also check raising crappy made hands that we beat. And because of that, we want him to stay in with those crappy made hands. And by shoving on him, he's going to fold those crappy made hands. Let's see. Mike says, aren't we missing value this way by checking the turn? Well, we're betting the turn. We're not checking the turn. This is cash games we're talking about. We don't get a stack by checking the turn. Well, no, we're betting the turn. You guys are asking, how do I see these questions? I actually don't know. I'm not too sure how you see these questions. I can see them on my end. I'm reading them as they come in. Okay, yeah, I'm being told you guys cannot see the questions. All right, and there are a lot of questions. There are plenty of hands, so don't worry. If we go at this rate, we're never going to get through this webinar. Dan says, if the villain plays a lot of suited connected cards, should we be more prone to check behind? And I think that's somewhat true. The thing is that you have to realize, what if he has 10-9 of hearts, right? I mean, he could easily have 10-9 of hearts, 10-9 of diamonds, 10-9 of clubs. And I think that he's still going to call with a lot of those hands. Tyler said, how much would we base calling in the spot based on his tells? Somewhat frequently. If we think the guy looks very weak, then I think it's a pretty great spot to call. And we're going to talk about tells a little bit later, but both online and live players do have lots of tells. I mean, online they can time their sizes a little bit funny. They can make their bet sizing weird. They can think forever then raise. Whatever. There are a lot of things they can do. We're going to discuss all of that later. Okay, let's see what else we have. If he check raises a turn. Okay, so Dan asked, if he check raises a turn and the clip hits on the river and he bets big, do we call? Absolutely, because half the draw is missed. we're not concerned with him having exactly one draw. We're concerned with his range of hands. And if his range of hands includes diamonds and clubs, that means he only has it half the time, and even then he could have a worse made hand. Tyler says, if he pushes with a short stack after the turn, do we call again? Yes, we're not concerned with that. We're more concerned with keeping him in with all of his hands. Okay, so Tony asked a good question. What if this hand happens in the first 5 minutes of the day? So we sit down, we don't know anything about this guy. Well, if he's a young kid and he has a lot of chips in front of him, I'd be more prone to call. If he's an old guy wearing a suit and he has almost, and he looks like he's played no hands, all of his chips are $25 chips and just a few $5 chips and no $1 chips, which means he's not winning the blinds and small pots, I'd be way more prone to fold. So I would use baseline reads on the guy. And the less information you have about your opponent, the more prone you should be just to check back and see what happens. But I do think this is a very standard value bet spot on the river, because I think you're going to get somewhat accurate information. So I would probably go ahead and value bet the river. Maybe something like 35 or 40. Again, you don't want to bet huge, because if you bet huge, he's going to fold out everything that you beat. All right, and Jacob asks, what is the bottom of my value triple betting range in this spot? For example, do we value bet jacks to aces when check to? I would probably value bet aces, although I think aces is close. Actually, I may check back aces. The problem with aces is that he could easily have 9-8 or 10-9 at that point. And he's not going to call a reasonable bet with Jack-9 very often. So, yeah, I would probably check back with aces on this river. So I guess the bottom of my value betting range is pocket fours. Or maybe 9-8. I'd probably value bet 9-8. Dan says, if we have a flush on this board, do we bet and then call a raise? And the answer is, again, no against a tight guy, yes against a loose guy. If we don't know anything, I'm probably going to call initially, because it's somewhat difficult for him to have a flush, and he could be overvaluing a straight. I would hate the spot, but I would probably go ahead and call. All right, so that's this hand. Okay, we have a whole lot more hands. Let's go and move into the next one. This one's going to be a little bit simpler. So we raise pocket sevens, and look at this. They give us the nuts. This is a spot where I think slow playing's pretty good, because now if we bet, he has to have a 7, which he can't, or a jack in order to call. He could have something like 8s, 9s, or 10s and call, but he's probably not going to want to put in a ton of money by the river anyways. And by checking, perhaps we look somewhat weak. I'm really not a fan of slow playing very often, and you see the example I give. We have to flop 4 of a kind. And because of that, I mean, I think it's very difficult to find a good spot to slow play. Whenever you have a very good hand, you want to put money in the pot. And by checking, you don't put money in the pot. So if our opponent is super aggressive in this scenario, you could certainly consider betting. The problem with checking is that if we check and he bets, we can't really check raise, because then we look like we have a 7. And that means our opponent's going to have a 7 or better to call. And again, that's pretty impossible. So this is a spot where I would probably go ahead and check. It goes check, check. So now, on the turn, we still have the nuts, right? And it's somewhat difficult for our opponent to have too much, but now we need to go ahead and start getting money in the pot. If our opponent has ace high, he may call one time. If he has total garbage, he's not going to put money in the pot at any point. So this is an area where we do need to bet. And at this point, we don't need to bet big, because if we bet big, he's going to fold out everything. So we don't need to bet $15 or $30. I see a lot of players in this scenario bet something like $30 because they're upset because they didn't get value on the flop. So if I'm going to bet, it'd probably be something like 10. And then I do bet 9. It's a reasonable bet. It looks like we're trying to pick up the pot. And I think this is going to be a good sizing. Dan asked, what would he check behind on the flop with? I think he'd check behind with everything that's worse than a jack. So, basically, most of his range, he's going to check back the flop because he doesn't have anything. If he's aggressive, he could bet with a lot of stuff. I mean, I know if I'm in my opponent's shoes, if the hero checks the flop, I'm going to bet the flop and probably bet the turn because I want to try to look like I have the 7, but once he calls the turn, it's going to be clear I'm not getting a fold. But most passive players who you're going to be playing against at 1-2 and 2-5, they're just going to check back if they have all sorts of stuff. So my plan on the turn is to bet and proceed from there. So when he calls, that's good news. It means he probably has some sort of pair. He could have ace high, he could have queen 10, he could have 8-6, but it's good news. On the river, we again could slow play, but notice if he has something like pocket 10s and we check, he's just going to check behind and we're not going to get any value. Same thing goes if he has 9-8, he's going to check behind most of the time. And if we do check and he bets and we raise, he's not going to call with any of those hands. So at this point, there's no purpose at all in checking. So we need to value bet. So I'm going to bet something like 20 bucks, I imagine, and 19 I have listed here. I think that's, anywhere between probably 15 and 20 is perfectly acceptable. And he called a pocket eights and we got some value. And he may have called two streets either way if we bet the flop and bet the turn. But by checking the flop, you're generally going to look somewhat weak. It's not necessarily that you're going to look weak, but you're going to look polarized. And what that means is you're either going to have a very strong hand or a very weak hand. And it's way easier to have a very weak hand than it is to have a very strong hand. Dan says if he has ace-jack and you check call the flop, do you check raise the turn? If he has ace-jack, well, I don't know he has ace-jack. Oh, so let's say he check calls the flop. He can't check raise the turn because if I check, he can bet, and then if I raise, he can't check raise. I guess you're asking what does he do if I check raise? So let's say he's sitting with ace-jack over here. He bets the flop, I call. And on the turn, I check, he bets. I check, he bets, and I raise. See, the problem with this is that I'm not so sure that check raising is ever good with this hand because it should be somewhat clear to your opponent that you are representing a very strong hand, and it's very difficult for your opponent to have a strong hand to play against you. I mean, you're obviously going to check raise the river if you check. If he bets the flop, bets the turn, you're going to check raise the river, of course. But I think check raising earlier in the hand is not going to be very profitable for you. It's going to scare your opponent out most of the time. All right, so what's going to happen is every 30 minutes I'm going to have to pause the video. That way the files do not become too large. So I'm going to pause the video just as soon as I get done with this question. Tyler says, do you think there's some sort of psychological benefit to betting 19 versus 20? I noticed you made bets like that before. Is there any explanation or is it random? All right, against random bad players who are not going to realize what you're doing, I feel like a larger bet size, which is going to be a pile of chips, you're putting in 3 $5 chips and 4 $1 chips. I feel like those tend to get called a little bit more frequently than a smaller chip bet. I feel like a lot of people think if you bet something like 25 versus 24, they feel like 25 is generally stronger. So I try to throw out a lot of chips to try to make it look scary in their mind. I definitely do not do this against good players. Against good players, I always bet really clean, even numbers, because that way you have to put in fewer chips, so you're less likely to give off some sort of shaking tell. And it's very easy to have a general system, so I usually tend to bet very round numbers against good players. Tyler says, I've read that in books, less chips looks easier to call. And you're exactly right, so that's why I flip it on its head. Because most people think, oh, less chips is easier to call, so I'm going to do that. But I tend to do what I mean, most everyone has read a lot of fairly basic poker books, and they know basic stuff. So like, oh, when a guy bets a small amount, he's trying to make it he's trying to make it look easy to call, so I'm going to call those. So knowing that, I'm going to bet a larger amount of chips most of the time against fairly weak players, because they've read that in a book, and they think that the big amount of chips is me trying to scare them into folding. So now they're going to call every time. And if I want them to call every time, I need to bet a large amount of chips, and that's going to make them call more often. So, I mean, I guess against absolute base level players, you should probably assume they haven't read anything. But you're going to find that most people who are playing poker in today's age have some level of competence. They're not brain dead or anything. So that's why I do what I would do. Jacob said, it's good to see that we are betting with the nuts. What about the rest of our range? I'm probably continuation betting most of my range in this spot. Glenn says, do I ever back up my bet on the river with the nuts? So do I make a smaller bet on the river? I mean, the only point of that is to... Say I bet 19 on the turn, and on the river, would I ever bet 15 or 14? Definitely not, because I think that it's very likely that he has some sort of made hand, and he's not going to bluff. I mean, people don't run insane bluffs on the river too often. If you know you're against someone like that, then yeah, do whatever induces the bluff. But against most people, they're going to have some random pair, and they're going to call. Dan says, if I check call on the flop with this and the turn, I would be afraid he would check behind on the river if I don't bet out. Yeah, and that's why you want to try to get money in the pot somehow as the aggressor, but this is one of those rare spots where slow playing does tend to make a lot of sense, because our hand looks somewhat weak by checking. I mean, I think most people think our best value hand in this spot is something like pocket tens, so I think it is a good spot to go ahead and check, because he might try to bluff us off of it. Dan says if we get check raised in this situation as the button with ace-jack on the flop or the turn, what do we do? Say on the flop we get check raised. It's pretty nasty, but I guess I'd call and then be very unhappy. It's not a good spot at all. You don't want to get check raised when you have ace-jack because you have a bluff catcher. And it's a nasty spot. I think against straightforward players, it's a pretty good spot to fold, and that's the reason I said that you don't want to check raise in this with this hand, because it makes it really easy for your opponents to fold. All right, so I'm going to pause the video, and I'll be right back in about 20 seconds.